To prevent a second Castro, the U.S. has always been very sensitive to changes that could threaten Washington's policy on both American continents. In the first half of the 20th century, the U.S. did not hesitate to send troops to those Latin American countries where the White House believed that something contrary to the interests of its northern neighbor was taking place. The Cold War, which began after 1945, only served to increase U.S. fears of losing control over the rest of the U.S. states and of seeing the emergence of regimes favored by the USSR. Preventing revolutions and the rise to power of leftist parties became the goal of U.S. foreign policy. Frightened by the events in Cuba and eager after the emergence of Fidel Castro's regime to prevent such a scenario at all costs. Dominican Republic in the first half of the 20th century. Located on the island of Haiti, Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, like other Latin American states in the Caribbean, received increased attention from Uncle Sam. The Americans saw it as a valuable source of agricultural products. The island's proximity to the United States allowed it to quickly intervene in the affairs of the states located on it. Thus, in 1915, a military intervention was carried out in Haiti, and in 1916, it was the turn of the Dominican Republic. For several years, the island, which was halfway from the U.S. East Coast ports to the Panama Canal, and therefore also had an important military significance, was in the hands of the U.S. military administration. The occupation of the Dominican Republic ended in 1924, but the U.S. had no intention of losing control of the country. As historian and sociologist Michael Mann notes, in the late 1920s, the United States leadership, responding to voter demand for a softer foreign policy, found a new tactic: training the local military to suppress opposition. Out of their circle came clientelist dictators who maintained order with U.S. economic and military aid. Of course, the White House did not forget to protect its proxies, albeit those tainted by crimes. "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch," a phrase attributed to the U.S. Secretary of State in 1933-1944, Cordell Hull. This is how he characterized General Rafael Trujillo, who gained power in 1930 after a military coup in the Dominican Republic. Trujillo was in power for more than 30 years, not forgetting the welfare of his family and closest supporters. They controlled 35% of cultivated agricultural land and 63% of sugar production, the most profitable sector of the Dominican economy. Naturally, no taxes from these revenues were paid into the state treasury. Everything was deposited in the pockets of the dictator and his relatives. Attempts by the opposition to fight legally were harshly repressed, and all conspirators were subjected to torture and execution. In the 1950s, however, the number of conspiracies and the number of participants seriously increased. It was felt that Dominican society was fatally tired of the power of the dictator and his clan, but needed an external impetus for the regime to collapse. The position of Trujillo, who had willingly sheltered out-of-power Latin American leaders like Batista of Cuba or Pérez Jiménez of Venezuela, was shaken just after the spectacular success of the Cuban revolutionaries. The U.S. decided to change its policy in Latin America by withdrawing its support from odious personalities like Trujillo. The CIA, apparently unable to reach an agreement with Trujillo, organized his assassination in 1961. This was followed by his sons fleeing the country and newly formed political parties. Only one was allowed under Trujillo, vying for power. The 1962 presidential election was won by Juan Bosch, who sat in the presidency from February to September 1963. Bosch, clearly sympathetic to the socialist movement, began a series of reforms, the most fatal for him being the reduction of spending on the army and limiting its participation in the political life of the country. This led to a conspiracy among top officers and a military coup. Juan Bosch fled the country, and power ended up in the hands of the so-called triumvirate, which was not recognized by the United States, although it pursued an anti-communist policy. The political crisis of 1965 and U.S. intervention. In 1965, the disparate groups opposing the triumvirate united, led by Colonel Francisco Caamaño. The opposition attempted to overthrow the triumvirate, return Juan Bosch, and restore the constitution adopted under him, which is why they are usually called constitutionalists. The uprising began on April 24, 1965, and took the U.S. leadership by surprise. However, after several days, when it became clear that the forces of the military junta, loyalists, would not be able to cope with the constitutionalists on their own, Lyndon Johnson decided to support the former, because he and his advisors feared a repetition of the Cuban events. April 30th, the first forces of the 82nd Airborne Division of the United States landed at the airfield controlled by the Loyalists, and then from bases in Puerto Rico were transferred additional forces totaling 27,000 people. Despite armed clashes between Loyalists and U.S. Army units on the one hand and Constitutionalists on the other, the Dominican Parliament on May 4th managed to appoint Camaño as president of the country. He did not officially leave the post until September 1965. First of all, the American troops were tasked with ensuring the safety of their country's citizens. Landed on the coast near the capital Santo Domingo, the Marines had to take control of the buildings where Americans and other foreigners had taken refuge. On the night of May 2nd, U.S. paratroopers moved from the airfield where they had landed toward the capital and established communications with Marines, also advancing into the city. The Americans blockaded the areas where the Constitutionalists were located, setting up 7 checkpoints through which citizens could pass only after being thoroughly searched with metal detectors. A measure that had to be resorted to because there was no other way to search Dominican women in loose dresses that could hide anything. The operation, called Power Pack, also involved troops from other Latin American countries as part of the Inter-American Peace Force. In this way, the U.S. sought to make the intervention look like a life-saving and life-protecting operation during a civil conflict. The peacekeepers included 130 Brazilians, 250 Hondurans, 184 Paraguayans, 160 Nicaraguans, 21 Costa Ricans, and 3 Salvadorans. All of them, according to the U.S. military, were very poorly equipped and trained, and therefore rather hindered the fight against the constitutionalist detachments. It was possible to evacuate 6,500 citizens of the United States and other nations from the Dominican Republic. Fighting between American units and constitutionalists took place mainly in the cities. The fiercest clashes took place in the capital. According to various estimates, from 3,000 to 4,000 Dominicans and 27 Americans were killed. Another 156 Americans were wounded. The Marines encountered several Swedish-made L-60 tanks and destroyed them with 106 mm M40 recoilless guns. One of Camaño's squads knocked Loyalists off a cargo ship, from where they opened fire on American paratroopers, who responded with shots from the same M40s and sank the transport. The last major battles took place in June 1965. By that time, the Marines had left. Only paratroopers remained. When the Constitutionalists attacked the location of the 82nd Division and a Brazilian unit with grenade launchers, machine guns, and tanks. The attack ended with the defeat of the Constitutionalists, who lost at least 67 men. The Americans and Brazilians who launched a counteroffensive cleared several dozen city blocks in Santo Domingo. The defeat forced the Constitutionalist leadership to the negotiating table. Later, large forces of Loyalists and Constitutionalists clashed in the city of Santiago, north of Santo Domingo. The former attacked a funeral procession of the latter, and the firefight lasted 5 hours until U.S. helicopters and infantry intervened. The U.S. Army also began propaganda work with the help of a special psychological warfare unit, 1st Psychological Warfare Battalion, stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, rushed to the island and placed at the disposal of the leadership of the local branch of the U.S. Information Agency. The agency specifically turned to the Army because the military could quickly provide propagandists with the necessary equipment. On May 5, 1965, the Voice of the Security Zone, radio station went on the air, operated by military specialists deployed from North Carolina, and the broadcasts were written and recorded by information agency employees who knew Spanish and the realities of the Dominican Republic. The transmitters were powerful enough to cover most of the country. In all, more than 600 hours of programs were recorded for broadcast over loudspeakers in populated areas, and more than 900 hours for radio. The Army radio station also rebroadcast Voice of America programs for 35 days. In addition, the 1st Psychological Battalion, a U.S. Air Force plane with a radio transmitter on board, and special teams on U.S. Navy ships blockading the coast were engaged in signal suppression on the broadcast frequencies of the radio constitutionalists, who managed to seize several powerful transmitters. In the end, the Americans were only able to suppress them during a special military operation to destroy the enemy's radio sites. By the end of 1965, the resistance of the constitutionalists was broken. On September 3rd, the Provisional Government of the Republic was headed by Hector Garcia Godoy, and in 1966, after the withdrawal of American troops, Joaquin Balaguer became president, a man very close to Trujillo, who adopted many of the methods of governance of the late dictator. Francisco Camaño managed to escape. Having escaped death in the attack of loyalists in Santiago, he went by order of Garcia Godoy, military attaché, to London, from where he went to Cuba. In 1973, Camaño attempted a rebellion in the mountains of the Dominican Republic with a group of associates, but was captured and executed. Operation Power Pack showed that the U.S. had no intention of losing allies in the Caribbean, especially on important islands like Haiti. Balaguer's rise to power showed that the White House would maintain, albeit with some modifications, its previous policy of supporting strong authoritarian leaders capable of providing the order the U.S. needed in their countries under the conditions of the Cold War.